Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Scott. I'm with the Great Plains Institute. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. I want to welcome you to our building sector decarbonization webinar. This is a product of the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative, and I'll talk about them for just a moment here in a couple of seconds. But this is actually the third roadmap that's been released by the Power Sector Collaborative over the last 3 years. And so I want to give you a little bit of background on the group itself. So the Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaborative started almost 10 years ago now as a group interested in a Midwest approach to what were perceived at the time to be coming carbon regulations from the federal government, what turned out to be the Clean Power Plan. This group actually started meeting before the Clean Power Plan was introduced by US EPA. The group started working through the Clean Power Plan, made a number of recommendations to US EPA, was actually credited by US EPA as they made some changes between the draft of the Clean Power Plan and the final document. And so really working on kind of a Midwest response to that, looking at the issues of training and leakage and all the things that were important there. A really great group of folks in the Power Sector Collaborative that were made up of utilities, non-governmental organizations, some of our not-for-profits working on environmental causes, some state officials, co-ops, municipal power, third-party providers, basically everybody who touches the energy space in the Midwest had representation among that group. And so it's been together a long time. There are a lot of members who are still part of that group who were there at the beginning. I was actually used to be a member of the group when I was an official in Illinois and moved over when I moved to GPI to just working with the group then. In 2016, the group decided that they needed to pivot. And so as the slide will show you, instead of talking about the Clean Power Plan, which obviously at the end of 2016 looked like it was not going to end up coming into fruition by the federal government when the administrations changed, this group decided they didn't want to break up at that time. They wanted instead to look at decarbonization pathways, understanding that decarbonization was something that was going to be coming. It was going to be something that was going to be hitting them if they were a utility or if they were a state or if they were a third-party provider. So they decided that they wanted to keep meeting and talk through these issues and see if they could come up with some pathways to decarbonization. And so the first roadmap that was issued by this group is the one on your screen, the electricity sector. That was released in July of 2018. The transportation electrification roadmap was released in January of 2019. And now today we're releasing the roadmap to decarbonization in the building sector. I want to credit Franz Litz, who's with GPI, as well as with Litz Strategies, who has facilitated and worked with this group since its inception, as well as Brad Crabtree from the Great Plains Institute as well. And we also have the great work from Kate Sullivan working with this group as well. So on this, and the groups have changed a little bit over time. There are some folks who have been with us since the beginning. But if you go to the next slide, Kate, and we'll look at the participants for this buildings roadmap, you see in front of you the array of participants that we had that helped put this roadmap together. And this has been part of the work of the Power Sector Collaborative over time. We have had different groups that participated on the transportation sector, actually forming another group just to look at transportation in the Mid-Continent area as well. And of course, when we talk about the Mid-Continent, as you're going to hear in a little while, we're talking about basically the MISO footprint. So everything from Montana down through the Gulf Coast, which Jessi will talk about in just a few minutes. So we obviously know that buildings are a very important part of greenhouse gas emissions. And again, dealing with the entire MISO footprint, so a variety of climates, which affect the policy choices and effectiveness of those options. And you're going to hear about that going forward. So we're really glad you're with us today. as we move forward, if you want to send me a question in the chat or just put comments in the chat, that's fine. We'll take questions for each of the speakers at the end of their presentations. But if you want to send the questions through the chat or use the raise your hand function on your screen, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of each speaker's presentation. So let me turn first to Jessi Wyatt. Jessi is with the Great Plains Institute, and she's going to take us through the findings that are located in the roadmap. Jessi joined GPI in 2017. She is an energy planner and analyst, and her technical and analytical support, she adds her expertise to a variety of projects and programs with a focus on local energy and climate action planning and geospatial analysis. Also assists with carbon capture and storage modeling, bioeconomy analytics, and transportation and fuels, as well as strategic mapping for policy initiatives. Before GPI, Jessi worked at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs as a GIS analyst. She has a Master of Urban and Regional Planning with a minor in GIS from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and a Bachelor's in Environmental Sciences, Policy and Management from the University of Minnesota as well. So Jessi, thanks very much for all your work on this, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. I didn't know I was getting such an in-depth background. So now you all know my life story. Just kidding. I'm Jessi Wyatt, energy planner analyst at the Great Plains Institute. I think we're going to spend some time today just going over some cursory, high-level findings and analysis from the Buildings Decarbonization Roadmap, which I had the pleasure of getting to work on with a lot of folks on the call. So as Doug outlined, the Buildings Roadmap is the third in a series of three, following the electricity sector and transportation electrification roadmaps. Another shout out to Franz Litz, who facilitated these three bodies of work and convened the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative throughout. So this is that key geography that Doug alluded to, that the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative stakeholders honed in on to identify the study states for analysis across the roadmap. So you'll see, as was mentioned, it extends from Minnesota, North Dakota, all the way down to Louisiana. You'll also see another map in a couple of slides, which is more of a configuration to the MISO footprint that Doug was talking about. But here you can see the states that we were thinking about. So why buildings? As shown in these two pie charts, buildings contribute a large portion of total US emissions. And that's true when we look at a combination of direct and indirect, as well as indirect emissions alone. So when indirect emissions from electricity generation are included, as seen in the pie chart at left, emissions from the commercial and residential sectors made up nearly 1/3 or 32% of US greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. When we isolate just direct emissions from the commercial and residential building sector, emissions are about 12% of all direct emissions by sector. So we know, therefore, that the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector will be critical if we want to achieve any substantive carbon emissions reductions by mid-century, which I think we're in consensus that we do. So there emerged a handful of high-level strategies available to tackle building decarbonization, and we'll see how each of these sort of thread through the presentation today. The first is enhancing building design to be more energy efficient. And that occurs both through new construction as well as improvements to existing infrastructure like retrofits. The second is finding alternatives to fossil fuels, including electricity and renewable natural gas. And finally, technology innovation. And that's both improvements in technology as well as advancements in deployment of technology. And here there's particular emphasis on heat pumps. So a model called Facets was used to analyze decarbonization scenarios throughout our process. It utilized the EIA annual energy outlook data and the IEA times modeling framework. The diagram here shows an extremely simplified schematic of how the model kind of works. So it first assesses the resource supplies on fuel availability. An example of that would be the electric generators that might serve a heat pump. It then determines the most economic choice across all technologies and fuels or devices. And finally, it assigns use, the end use or demand for each of those devices. And that includes building energy uses like heating and cooling, as well as a couple others. So like I said, very simplified, but it gives you an understanding of kind of how the model flows. So to understand the resource supply element, that first component, the model was run to forecast first business as usual electricity fleet capacity. What happens if we do nothing? What we see between now and 2050 is an increase in capacity up to about 2,000 gigawatts, which is met with additions of wind, shown in green, and solar, shown in yellow, as well as natural gas, shown in dark brown. We also can note that there are coal retirements under the business as usual reference case, again, without any intervention. The business as usual electricity generation mix, so we just looked at capacity, which is what could the infrastructure supply, and then the generation mix, which is what does the infrastructure actually generate. And the generation mix does reflect the capacity build out. So we see less coal over time, gray at the bottom, and increased use of wind and solar renewables, as well as natural gas. This graphic provides a breakdown of the percent of generation from carbon-free sources over the model, the 30-year modeled period. We see that market forces and already existing incentives do drive renewable and carbon-free generation to just over 50% by 2050, but that there remains quite a ways to go to full decarbonization. We then wanted to see what would happen in the electricity sector with the introduction of a 95% decarbonization policy. So unlike in business as usual, the generation fleet, so here we're back to capacity, completely phases out coal by 2050. So the gray at the bottom disappears. We also see additions of nuclear generation in blue, as well as natural gas outfitted with carbon capture technology. And then we'll note the dramatic increase in wind capacity across the region. You can also note that the generation, the total, the capacity is greater by 2050 under a 95% decarbonization policy, alluding to increased electrification broadly. So the generation from that same fleet under the 95% decarbonization scenario shows how almost all coal retires and no longer contributes to generation. The grid relies heavily instead on the renewable build out that we saw with wind in particular, as well as the utilization of natural gas, and that's natural gas both with through 2040, or excuse me, without carbon capture through 2040, and with sort of introduced in the middle period of the model, or in the middle period of the modeled period, around 2030, and that's to supply electricity to the Midcontinent. So with that knowledge, we then ran a bunch of building decarbonization scenarios. So the figure here is depicting the range of potential emissions reductions that we found across all our scenarios for residential buildings. In some cases, we saw significant reductions, so the upper range of this graphic, which approached 50 million tons, while in others, the reductions were much less, more in the realm of 10 million tons. And that's much less, especially considering we're going to mid-century. So you'll note that we found that a key determinant of total emissions reductions was directly related to assumptions around heat pump performance technology, so that blue versus green breakout. For those less familiar, which I'm not sure if is many on the call, heat pump technology provides heating and cooling for buildings by forcing exterior thermal air through a fan or compressor mechanism, which can then heat or cool internal spaces as shown in the diagram here. And a huge benefit of the schematics of a heat pump is that in having to power so few components, it's extremely efficient. So across by the end of it all, thousands of scenarios run, we found that reducing barriers to adoption and improving technology were key factors in reducing building emissions. So what we did was isolate the key factors most determinative of the emissions reductions to identify key scenarios to analyze. The first was speed and rate of heat pump technology deployment across the Midcontinent, and that captured both advancements in technology as well as adoption. The second was heat pump technology performance, as I sort of noted, which determined whether the backup heat is required below 10 degrees Fahrenheit for heat pumps, or if it can be supplied to augment a heat pump that functions on a linearly decreasing basis to 20 degrees below zero. So when I refer to this moving forward, it'll be backup versus linear. And I'll note that for linear performance, as heat pump capacity degrades linearly with temperature, so it doesn't work quite as well the colder it gets, the backup requirement is the difference between the total demand and the amount of that demand that the heat pump can supply. So it's pretty, well, somewhat simple math. Third was whether the assumed hurdle rate, and hurdle rate here is serving as a proxy for the component barriers that could prevent heat pump adoption. So it may include cost, education, et cetera. Whether that hurdle rate more closely resembled a 20% cost adder or a 7.5% cost adder. So when we say low investment hurdle rate, we're saying we're going to reduce it from 20% to 7.5% in the analysis. The fourth was the big one. It was a combination of all three factors. Maybe no surprise, the modeling scenario that achieved the deepest reduction by 2050 did assume a combination of all these three critical factors. So it was rapid advancement of heat pump technology, linear backup requirements, along with measures to reduce the effective hurdle rates. So the next couple of slides will dive a little more into the findings around heat pumps in the Midcontinent. We already understand that present-day adoption of heat pump technology is directly related to regional climate. So the graphic shown here is household fuel technology estimates for both the southern Midcontinent, that top bar, and the northern Midcontinent regions of the study area. You can see the existing proportion of households with heat pumps is shown in bright green. And historically, we have seen heat pump adoption occur organically in the southern Midcontinent as a home heating and cooling technology. However, heat pumps have been much less attractive in the colder climate of the northern Midcontinent, just because the backup fuel is required and climatic conditions pose additional barriers. This is the map I talked about earlier. So to delve into slightly more granularity, when using the facets model to analyze the Midcontinent, we based the North, Central, and South regions on EIA Annual Energy Outlook, or AEO subregions, that were then aggregated up to regions and states. So this final breakout here is showing the North, Central, and South regions that we analyzed. And the reason I'm showing you this is because the next three slides will go over some region-specific findings. And for those familiar with MISO's footprint, you'll see here how it more closely resembles that. Okay, so this graphic is showing share of device counts, or the number of installed devices across all households by year for the northern region. Because this is showing share of technologies chosen for install, it's important to understand that there may be households with more than one device. For example, when there's a supplementary technology to a heat pump, like wood, which you can see in this graphic, or natural gas, it is being chosen as the backup. And this doesn't indicate the consumption from technologies or that the technologies are all being used the same amount. We also know that some technologies, for example, ductless mini splits, automatically include an inherent backup, which is electricity. So if they were chosen by the model, there would automatically be 2 devices added for one household. So if we look a little more closely at this graphic for the northern region of the Midcontinent, the main area of the graph at far left shows business as usual share of devices from 2020 to 2050. So what do installs look like if we do nothing? For the northern region, you see a moderate increase in heat pump installations, though natural gas, forced air, room air, and central air still dominate the share of devices through 2050. To then investigate those scenarios, we isolated the last 10 years of the analysis, so 2040 through 2050, and you can see that it's bordered in this black line, to investigate the impact of each of those scenario levers on the building device counts. So you'll note that as in the previous graphs, heat pumps are shown in bright green, but the key findings here are first that each of the scenario levers does result in heat pump adoption and penetration. So you see across those 4 broken out 10-year periods that the share of green is increasing over time. We also see that when either the technology is more advanced for the northern climate, so what you see as that rapid HP tech scenario, or the hurdles like cost are reduced, the low hurdle rate scenario, we see the most significant impact on heat pump adoption. However, the greatest impact is available when, as we learned, all 3 scenarios or all 3 levers are implemented. So now that we're familiar with the graph, hopefully we see the same thing for the central region. We immediately note the different distribution of device installations across the business as usual, so 2020 to 2050, but there's far greater organic heat pump adoption due to the more mild climate of the central region. However, we do see that natural gas radiators and forced air, along with central and room air conditioning, still comprise the bulk of devices installed across the reference case. So when we isolate those same key scenarios, we find that heat pump technology advancement has the greatest single impact on adoption, resulting in a decrease in both room air and natural gas forced air as compared to the baseline. A reduction of the hurdle rate also has beneficial impact on heat pump adoption, with a similar profile for other devices as did improvements in heat pump technology. Here, linear heat pump performance also results in increased adoption, though devices are largely supplanted with electric radiators. And when we stack all three levers, we see the greatest heat pump adoption, as well as replacement of most natural gas fuel technologies with electric alternatives. And for those who read the roadmap, you may already be familiar with some of these. So finally, the southern region. We immediately see that in the south, heat pumps are flourishing by comparison to the north and central regions. And that's due primarily to the climatic conditions. So here under business as usual, installs still surpass 40% of households by 2050 with no intervention. But room air remains the second most adopted device by share. There's also already a fair amount of electric resistance heat, though I mentioned ductless mini splits earlier. I'll caveat that the model likely wouldn't have chosen ductless mini splits as they're fairly expensive to run, but that devices may have been installed when natural gas was historically more expensive. So in the southern region, as we investigate those scenario levers, we find that heat pump technology advancement results in the greatest impact to heat pump adoption, as does reduction of the hurdle rate. Interestingly, the combination of all three levers, the all three scenario, doesn't quite achieve the same heat pump adoption compared to the other two variables, or the dramatic magnitude, I should say. And naturally, in the southern climate, heat pump performance has the lowest impact on adoption rates, though it does slightly increase installs. Across all scenarios, the primary alternative or supplementary devices for the southern region remained room air and electric radiators, regardless of the scenario, while all but heat pump performance resulted in a decrease in natural gas devices. So I wanted to take a few moments to discuss renewable natural gas. The model did make renewable natural gas, or RNG, available to buildings across scenarios, but it was using a publicly available cost curve from the Annual Energy Outlook, which suggests that RNG is more expensive than other available fuels, including natural gas and electricity. So because of this, only when the analysis assumed a carbon constraint requiring the emissions decrease by 95% by 2050, or that 95% decarbonization policy, did we see that the model shows some uptake of RNG in the building sector, shown here in yellow. However, we recognize that RNG will likely be a key player in helping achieve sector-wide decarbonization in buildings. Finally, as alluded in the initial list of strategies we discussed, we analyzed impacts of the various scenario levers on building shell or envelope improvements, which captures things like weatherization or other efficiency improvements like retrofits. Unlike share of devices installed or some of the other dimensions that the roadmap did investigate, we found that the single greatest factor for building envelope improvements was the hurdle rate, which again was that proxy lever for the many barriers that might exist to undertake improvements, and that would include cost. The graphic here shows the additional share of regional households adopting building shell improvements when we shift the hurdle rate from 20% to 7.5%, and it is adjusted from baseline. So building shell improvements are happening across all of these three regions at present, but we pretended like everything was zero until we intervened. So we see that reducing the hurdle rate from 20% to 7.5% has the greatest impact in the central region, with an increase in improvements of about 14%. This is followed by the northern region, where we see an almost 10% increase in shell improvements. And finally, the south, where building improvements increased by only 8%, which makes sense because it's likely where the improvements would have the lowest marginal cost return. We know that improving building envelopes will be a key strategy towards sector-wide decarbonization. So now that we've had what I consider a whirlwind overview of some of the primary analytical findings from the roadmap, what are our key takeaways? First, we found that the electric heat pumps provide the most promising building decarbonization strategy available. However, even with their promising nature, they didn't quite achieve total decarbonization. And this indicates that we need to stay vigilant on finding complementary creative solutions for the building sector. Other fuels like hydrogen or renewable natural gas will likely play a role in getting us the rest of the way there. We also deduced that energy efficiency is a no regret strategy. Building shell improvements help curb energy demand, and they can also occur in tandem to other technology deployments. So a true win-win. Similarly, reducing barriers to heat pump adoption can significantly increase adoption. We found that tactics to reducing adoption barriers may vary by region, so a climate-specific strategy will maximize impact. Our findings, as we discussed, sort of explored the heat pump limitations, including necessary backups for heat pumps in cold climates. Cold climate households can, however, utilize some emerging alternative fuels like renewable natural gas, though cost does remain a consideration. And finally, emerging fuels like hydrogen, synthetic natural gas, or on the slide SNG, and renewable natural gas will be crucial complements to the suite of tactics to achieve building sector decarbonization by mid-century. So with that, I thank you for taking some time with me today, and I believe we have a couple minutes for questions.
We do. Thanks very much, Jessi. That was a great presentation. Let's take time for questions. Anybody who have them, either send me a note in the chat or use the raise your hand function on the bar on the bottom of let me ask one, Jessi, in terms of, while we're waiting for questions to come in terms of policies, and I know you went through this, but there was a lot of information there. So in terms of policies that you were assuming as part of the modeling, what were some of the, I know it's probably good to go back over that just one more time, just to make sure that everybody's got a good handle on what might drive some of the different numbers.
Sure thing. So the three that we really honed in on when we were looking at across all the scenarios, and the reason we honed in on them is because we found them to be the most influential, was the first, the rapid deployment or advancement of technologies. So that's saying that heat pumps are going to become more efficient over time, and that they're also going to be deployed in more places. And we were sort of, and Franz can maybe feel free to augment as well if he has thoughts, we were sort of agnostic to how that occurred. It was more just the assumption that it would occur. So what your question about the policy, it's more of the outcome of a phantom policy. The second was the performance of the heat pump. So right now, there's sort of two modes of thinking around heat pump technology. The first being the backup requirements, which we chose a temperature threshold at which the heat pump says, I can no longer operate. You need to use a backup fuel. It would switch off and utilize that backup fuel. The other is linear performance, which means that as temperatures get more cold, the heat pump is going to be slightly less efficient, but it will continue to operate for longer. And so we were able to say whether one or the other was the technology being implemented. And then the third was, wow, I really got in my head there about the third was the hurdle rate, excuse me. And the hurdle rate was also agnostic to saying, we don't really have one preference or another, how you decrease the hurdle rate proxy from 20% to 7.5, but we're saying that you're reducing the barrier over half a margin.
Great, thank you. I'm scanning the chat here and seeing if anybody has any questions, or I'll also ask if anybody who is part of the group would want to weigh in here at all at this particular point. We're going to hear from a couple of people who were part of the group of participants who helped put this together, but see if anybody else wanted to weigh in here.
And I'll chime in. I assume, most people on the call probably have read the roadmap, and it's dense with findings. So I know we hit on a couple, but there are some really rich, analytical components to the modeling that was done, and it's a great body of work. So we could delve into any of the many findings, but we just pulled some of the highlights.
And in terms of the conclusions, I know from the earlier roadmap, one of the main, in the electricity sector roadmap, one of the big takeaways from that was, do as much energy efficiency as you possibly can. That was one of the main tenets of the first roadmap. And I assume from your last slide that that's also part of it here as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what we found was like with the other roadmaps, there's no silver bullet, right? Even though heat pumps have tremendous opportunity to impact emissions, they aren't going to get there on their own. So looking at sort of the portfolio of tactics is going to continue to be really important.
Very good. Thank you. Audrey Partridge has a question. Audrey, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Doug. I didn't know how to raise my hand, so I was sort of
That's okay. The chat works.
Okay, so I have a question for Jessi, and my question is, you know, the recommendations, there's 7 pretty dense recommendations, and a lot of those I think go to the 3 factors you talked about, which is speed of deployment, performance, and then this really important one, which is hurdle rate. And this is probably not a question you can answer, but in your gut, you know, if we did all 7, if we went full bore with all 7 of these recommendations, what, you know, does the most optimistic scenario you modeled out represent that, or would that be even further? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So my understanding of your question is, did any of the model scenarios get us to full decarbonization? And does that align with the recommendations? The yes and no. So the model scenarios, I think, were a little constrained, and part of the recommendations were built on those constraints and finding that, hey, you know, none of these are silver bullets, like I said, but that the recommendations would go further. And I think, obviously, I have to say, you know, we should pursue them all and see where it gets us. But it would be, I think, further than any of the most extreme or most optimistic modeling outputs that we saw.
Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Thanks, Jessi. Keith Riopel, you have a question you put in the chat, but do you want to say it out loud?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good. Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, so I haven't had a chance to read the report yet, and so this may be obvious in the report, but I'm just was wondering to what extent the heat pump discussions, especially the policy discussions, and the modeling for that matter, distinguish between ground source and air source heat pumps. Those are obviously very different technologies, different applications, different in their R&D, you know, curves, arcs over time. And so I just wonder sort of what are the takeaways, particularly in terms of the deployment efforts and the hurdle rate efforts between those 2 technologies.
Yeah, I'll try to answer, and if anyone else wants to chime in, please feel free. My understanding is, you know, ground source heat pumps were made in available technology, but I maybe touched on this, but didn't go into a ton of detail. The model's primary motive for any decision it made was economics. So because ground source heat pumps had the higher upfront cost than air source, they were very rarely chosen. And that was something we saw across a lot of the modeled technologies in fuel. So I did touch on RNG, and just because of the publicly available cost curve projection data that we had, it was assuming it was more expensive than things like electricity and natural gas and some other fuels. And we wanted to kind of caveat that those are the best projections we have, but that may not be the case, right? Like nobody can predict the future perfectly. So I think that that's likely applicable with your question of whether ground source versus air pump, heat pumps. They're both viable technologies, but that's sort of how the model operated.
Thanks.
And I know one of the recommendations at the end, or one of the findings and conclusions, talks about technology evolving over time and theoretically becoming less costly, which would obviously affect some of the results the way you've laid them out, Jessi, I'm guessing.
100%. And there's also so many soft things that the model can't get at, like personal preference. Like, you know, individual households may be rational actors, but their primary motive might not only be economics. And so we couldn't plug that in, so to speak.
Just follow up on that. It's interesting. There's different aspects of the economics of the technology, right? I have a ground source heat pump that heats and cools our home, and so I'm well aware the upfront costs are very large, and larger than they would be for air source heat pumps. On the other hand, you know, because of efficiencies and the life of the technology, you know, customers particularly, I guess, business and government, have found ground source heat pumps more economic to date. I mean, if you just look at deployment and installations, people have and businesses have been installing geothermal systems for years in Wisconsin, and that's not the case with air source heat pumps. So there's, obviously, I mean, it would seem the market would suggest that geothermal is actually more cost effective today, obviously for certain types of buildings and certain types of applications. So I was just wondering if, there was more geothermal earlier in the timeline and more air source heat pumps later and some replacement to that sort of thing. But I guess it all depends on how the economics are sort of calculated.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And I can't speak to current economics of either technology, but I know when we had to input assumptions into the model, it was that ground source was much more expensive. I also wonder if Audrey or Nick, who are on the call, have any responses to these comments.
Audrey, go ahead.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, Jessi, I do actually. I was going to type it in the chat. I will talk a little bit later about a process in Minnesota in an upcoming report where we did try to put in some modeling assumptions around geothermal technologies. And in that case, we were looking at the prospect of geothermal district loop systems, so a smaller district system in a neighborhood. And then we did some other modeling that did include some percentage of geothermal heat pumps as well. So I'll note that we don't have the report yet, but we had modeling performed by E3 for stakeholder process in Minnesota. And that report should be out in May, where we'll release the modeling results, and might be a good place to dig into the opportunities for geothermal technologies. Although I should caveat that there were lots of caveats around the modeling, because you really have to do some extensive surveying of your geothermal potential in the particular area that you're looking at. So it is really tricky to actually model out your geothermal potential. But some work has been done out in New England that did that. Bro-Happel did that for a group out in New England.
Thanks, Audrey. Thank you very much, Jessi. We appreciate it. Thanks everybody for your questions to Jessi. I'm going to turn now to a couple of people who participated in the roadmap process. I want to start with Nick Martin. Nick is the manager of environmental policy at Xcel Energy. He's been in that position since October of 2013. Nick participates regularly in the Utility Commission dockets and resource planning, CO2 regulation and costs, renewable energy tariffs, EVs, and performance-based regulation. He's a primary environmental and energy and policy expert for Xcel's Minnesota operating company, and helped design what may be very familiar to a lot of you, the Xcel's ambitious 80 and 100% decarbonization goals. And Nick spends a lot of time looking at technology options as well. He's got a BA in music from Yale. That was interesting reading about that, Nick. If you want to elaborate, feel free. And then his master's in energy and resources from Cal Berkeley. And Nick has been a major part of the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative for a number of years. And so we really value his participation and his expertise. And he's going to give you a little bit of a perspective from Xcel Energy on how they look at this and some of their ongoing work. So Nick, thanks very much for being with us today. And thanks for being such a great participant in the collaborative.
Great, thank you, Doug. Thanks for that very nice introduction, and Jessi for that great presentation on the roadmap. Appreciate the chance to give sort of a reaction today, and try to. I'm going to talk primarily about Xcel's own sort of natural gas decarbonization strategy, and try to tie that to some of the things that are highlighted in the roadmap. So you can advance. Just a little bit about. A reminder of Xcel Energy is a utility operating in 8 states as an electric utility, but we're a gas utility as well in 5 of those states, pretty significantly in Colorado, and then in the upper Midwest, Minnesota and North Dakota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So we have about 642,000 gas customers in those upper Midwest states, about 111 million decatherm sales in 2019, and about 13,000 miles of distribution system. So one of the interesting things about this, the states where we serve gas customers, is that these are, generally speaking, cold climate states where natural gas provides a lot of energy, affordable energy for heating. Our natural gas system delivered the equivalent of 16,000 megawatts of electricity in January 2020. So during the cold part of the year, the gas system is delivering a lot of energy. That's about the size of our entire installed electric capacity nationwide. And being cold winter states, these are not states that are easy to kind of fully electrify, as Jessi noted in talking about that component of the roadmap, looking at the climate gradient from north to south. So that's one of the interesting challenges of trying to find lower carbon alternatives to natural gas for building heating in the states that we serve. Next slide. Just a quick review of where we stand in terms of our carbon results. And this is what you see on the slide is for the electric side of our business. The rest of my presentation is going to talk about the gas side of our business. But 2020 was a great year. We hit 54% below 2005 emissions for the upper Midwest. You can compare that to the state of Minnesota's goal of 30% below 2005 by 2025. So by 2025, I expect that we will more than double the state's goal in terms of carbon reductions from electricity. That 54% also puts us more than halfway already to our 2050 goal. It was driven by primarily 3 things: a strong year for wind generation and additional wind capacity coming online, supplying about 21% of all our energy, all our electricity in 2020. A 19% decline in coal and gas generation, dominated by moving coal plants to flexible operations. So changing how we offer them into the market and operating them differently, less to accommodate more wind and solar. And finally, an excellent operating year for our nuclear plants, which had a combined capacity factor of 96%. So those are the primary drivers of ongoing, really strong performance in reducing carbon emissions from electricity. In terms of our future goals, we've announced these goals for 80% reductions by 2030, 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. Our Upper Midwest Resource Plan puts us on track to a little bit exceed that 80% goal. You can compare that to, the IPCC says that to get to, on an economy-wide basis, we need to reduce emissions about 50% by 2030 in order to be on track for the 1.5 degree warming goal. So, we're going to get to 80%. Xcel was the first utility to announce a 100% goal, but really throughout the industry, I think it's more than 24 other utilities have announced similar goals now. And one of the things we have highlighted is that really getting to that 100% carbon-free electricity is going to require new technologies for zero carbon dispatchable generation, long duration energy storage. And I'll come back to that point because it's kind of interesting in relation to how do we electrify a lot of building heating. But when we announced these goals, they motivated, I think, reasonable questions about what are we doing on the natural gas side of our business? And so that's what I'm going to focus on most in this presentation. Next slide. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I just want to highlight in recognition of GPI's great work. We've really valued our participation in the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative from the beginning. And it's been consistently really helpful for our own efforts as a company from the start, with its initial focus on the Clean Power Plan, to the electricity roadmap, which helped inform our 2018 goal announcement, to the transportation roadmap, which really articulated a strong utility role in EV adoption and in investing in charging infrastructure. And we've done quite a few EV filings since that time in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And then to the current buildings roadmap, which really resonates very well with our natural gas strategy, which focuses on building efficiency, beneficial electrification, and lower carbon fuels like renewable natural gas and hydrogen. So all of these efforts have been really complementary to work that's being done in the MPSC. Next slide. Before I jump into our own natural gas strategy, I just want to sort of set a little bit of context by pointing to the emissions that we're talking about. At a national level, greenhouse gas emissions from the residential and commercial sectors are about 12% of the economy-wide total. Most of that is building heating, and a lot of building heating is natural gas. And on the screen here is the similar picture for Minnesota. This shows greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector for 2005 through 2018. Again, residential and commercial emissions, which are the focus of this roadmap, are about 12% of the 2018 total. And that's dominated by natural gas used for building heating. And there's 2 points that jump out to me from this figure. The first one is that on the one hand, we're talking about a relatively small share of the economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions, right? So we need to balance investments in decarbonizing the building sector through alternatives to natural gas with investments in other sectors. We want to drive them down significantly. But before we decide we should drive those to zero, which could get really expensive as we go closer and closer to zero, we should also consider if there's more cost-effective reductions to be achieved in other sectors that are more of the emissions. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, though, emissions in those two sectors are definitely going in the wrong direction. Both have increased dramatically since 2005, and they will become a greater share of economy-wide emissions as electricity and transportation continue to decarbonize. So I think we do need to start working now on alternatives to sort of bend down the slope of the emissions in those sectors. Next slide. So when we talk about our natural gas decarbonization strategy, which is more fully summarized in a report we published in 2020 called Transitioning Natural Gas for a Low Carbon Future, we think of it in sort of 3 pieces, 3 tracks. 2 of them addressing methane emissions and 1 of them addressing carbon emissions from natural gas combustion. So I'll start with the middle one. In the middle is the gas distribution system that we actually own and control. And we're working, I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, but in terms of an overview, we're working to have the tightest system possible, minimizing methane emissions. Also starting to think about how to integrate lower carbon fuels like RNG and hydrogen into the existing distribution infrastructure. On the left is upstream natural gas. So this is production, processing, transmission, and storage, everything that happens before the natural gas comes to us. So we don't have as much direct control, but we can certainly exert some leverage over our suppliers to disclose and reduce methane emissions. So there's a piece of the strategy that focuses on that. And finally, on the right is carbon emissions, the carbon dioxide emissions. These, so to speak, belong to our customers because they're scope 1 emissions from natural gas combustion in their homes and businesses. But as their gas provider, we see it as our job increasingly to provide options for them to reduce those emissions, pretty much like we started doing 20 years or so ago with voluntary renewable electricity programs. So we're working on that piece of the strategy. Next slide. So first on managing methane emissions. This is both the upstream part and our own distribution system. On the distribution system, we've done a lot of work already. Since 2010, we've replaced about 3,000 miles of pipe. All known cast iron pipe and almost all the bare steel pipe has been replaced on our system. And that's important because that has, if you look at the EPA emission factors, that has higher methane emission rates than the pipe that we're replacing it with, which is about 3/4 of it is now plastic in distribution mains and services, and almost all the remainder coated steel with much lower emission rates. So between that and work that we're doing to minimize emissions that happen during maintenance and improving methane leak detection, our upper Midwest system has a methane emissions rate of below 0.2% today. That's the distribution part of the system. So it's a pretty tight system. Now on the upstream part, upstream of the city gate, or where we take control of the gas, our strategy focuses on, what leverage can we exert over our suppliers to get a better handle on methane emissions. So the first part of that just focuses on more disclosures and transparency, better measuring, sharing of best practices. We're asking our suppliers to calculate their methane intensity using the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative protocol, which looks at emission intensity or emissions relative to total throughput in each of 5 segments: onshore production, gathering and boosting, processing, transmission and storage, and distribution, right? And then as we get better data, thinking about procuring certified gas from suppliers that have lower than average methane emission intensity. We're a member of our nation's Energy Future, which is a coalition of natural gas companies throughout that supply chain, with a goal working to limit methane emissions to less than 1% of throughput by 2025. So far, One Future has significantly exceeded that goal. In 2019, the emissions methane intensity was 0.334%. And finally, these are all voluntary efforts, but we and EEI have also supported the current administration's effort to reinstate oil and gas sector methane rules, which over time will lower emissions from the industry in general. So that's the methane part of the strategy. Turning to the next slide, the customer carbon part of the strategy, and this is largely where the MPSC roadmap focuses. The challenges to this part of the strategy are really 3, I think. Technology, so the alternatives to natural gas for building heating are less mature and more costly than the alternatives we now have on the electricity side. Cost, all of the alternatives are significantly more expensive than natural gas. And equity, some of the alternatives could be regressive or increase energy burden for our lower income customers if not designed carefully, and I'll talk more about that. So our strategy in this part is really focused on targeted programs that are voluntary customer choice rather than mandates, and starting with pilots to kind of gain experience and be ready to scale those up as the technologies improve and costs come down. Those focus in 3 areas: improved efficiency, more efficient buildings, more efficient appliances. Secondly, beneficial electrification, so switching from natural gas to electricity in cases where that saves customers money, reduces emissions, and makes greater use of renewable electricity. And in that bucket, we're really focusing on things like all electric new builds, grid integrated water heaters, and over time, existing buildings with using electric air source heat pumps with gas backup. And then the third part of the strategy is really focusing on lower carbon fuels that use the existing natural gas infrastructure, things like renewable natural gas and hydrogen. Renewable natural gas, we're thinking about options around green tariffs and pilot programs. We have a really interesting hydrogen electrolysis pilot project at one of our nuclear plants, and are starting to look at different ways that hydrogen could be incorporated into the gas system, which has limits because of the existing infrastructure and appliances, but is one important piece of the picture. So next slide. I'm going to spend a couple slides here talking about a couple of the interesting challenges that we see, and then I'm going to wrap up with some sort of thoughts on outstanding questions. So this is what we, and I don't know if this is a broadly used term, but we think of as the peak heat challenge. What if we tried to shift all building space heating to electric by 2050? This and the next slide are based on some work that E3 did for us for our integrated resource plan. So electric air source heat pumps themselves are really efficient, 2, 3 times the energy output relative to input. So for much of the year, they can deliver building heating really efficiently. It's a great energy savings, but their efficiency declines with colder temperatures, and for the coldest weeks in our relatively cold states, they need backup. If you make that backup electric resistance heat, because, for example, you've eliminated the natural gas system and it's all electric, that's relatively inefficient backup, right? And so that means that you have to build the electric system to serve peak demand of basically peak demand dictated by electric resistance heating of all buildings on the coldest day of the year. So what that results in is a very high winter peak for a very short part of the overall year. On the next slide, you can see the result of that in the work that E3 did for our resource plan. We worked with them, we created a high electrification sensitivity that included enough electrification of transportation, building heating, water heating to reach the state's overall economy-wide 2050 goals. And what impacts would that have on the Xcel energy system in terms of both the peak demand and the increased overall energy consumption? We assume very low carbon electricity by that time. We assume significant building shell weatherization, so much tighter buildings. And what E3 did is developed hourly load shapes for the whole year out to 2050 based on a relatively cold weather year to sort of test the limits of this system. Some of those electrified loads are quite flexible, like EVs, transportation. That's a lot of energy, but it can be kept off peak by charging during the nighttime. Some of those loads, though, like building space heating, are not very flexible. You have to have heat at all times of the day, so you can't keep it off peak. And so what you see in the chart is that moving all of those loads to electricity, it's space heating that has the biggest impact on our system. And our system becomes a winter peaking system that is 2.5 times the current size of our system. And that's all driven by the need to deliver space heating, I shouldn't say all, but it's largely driven by the need to deliver space heating in the coldest week of the year and building the electric system to address that peak. This results in the need for a lot of firm capacity because that greatest peak demand for electricity happens at the same time when we tend to have the lowest renewable generation, including some stretches of renewable generation, wind and solar, that are shortfalls that are longer than you can address with really current or foreseeable battery technology. So you either need firm capacity or you need really long duration energy storage at that time, and you need to serve a much bigger peak. So what helps mitigate this peak heating challenge? Well, one, tighter building shells. E3 assumed quite a lot of building shell improvement, so that alone doesn't address, but it's important. Gas backup, so keeping the natural gas system, but only using it for those sort of coldest parts of the year for gas backup. And then, as Audrey mentioned, really interesting idea around geothermal district loops that could tap into ground heat, which actually significantly reduces that peak that you have to address. So I want to wrap up with just sort of 2 slides. And on this first one, you can go to the next slide. This is sort of a non-exhaustive list of what to me seem like some of the emerging policy questions and challenges that come out of this discussion. First, how low should we push natural gas use or emissions within economy-wide goals? So Minnesota's 80% by 2050 goal, or if you want to say the IPCC net zero by 2050 goal, if that's maybe a more appropriate goal these days to target 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Those are economy-wide goals. They don't specify a goal for natural gas emissions or for the building sector. So it could mean that we should push natural gas emissions and natural gas use to 0 in 2050. But the climate scenarios, IPCC and others, don't really support that conclusion. They don't suggest you have to eliminate natural gas use. And those last reductions could be really expensive. So at what point how low do we push them? And at what point does it make sense to invest the next dollar in some larger emitting sector of the economy? That's an interesting question that I think is just starting to be discussed. Secondly, the peak heat challenge that I talked about, and in particular, the overlap with the electric sector. So if you're trying to build a fully decarbonized electric sector, and we're seeing significant opposition to basically all types of firm capacity, gas, coal, nuclear. If you eliminate all of that, you're having to build, even just to address the current electric demand, you're having to build very significant redundant capacity, especially to address those times when renewable generation in the winter can be fall short of demand for extended periods longer than batteries, right? And so if on top of that, you're trying to build a much bigger system to address space heating, which has the largest peak at that same time, you've really got a challenge of significantly overbuilding the system, or else really needing, and this is why we talk about needing zero carbon dispatchable technologies, natural gas with CCS, hydrogen, new nuclear, things like that, and or long duration energy storage to address those shortfalls, as well as much flexible demand as we can put into the system. And related to that, a significant equity challenge. So you can mitigate the peak heat challenge by having natural gas backup, right, for those coldest parts of the year. You've got electric air source heat pumps delivering heat for a lot of the year. That's great. But that raises a separate issue. So now you've got electricity providing space heating for a lot of the year, but gas throughput is much lower because it's moved into kind of a backup role. You're still maintaining the gas system though. So the fixed costs are not very different, but they're recovered over much fewer therms. And that means under the current rate structure, higher rates. So higher rates are fine as long as bills are lower, but for whom are the bills going to be lower? Low to moderate income customers are probably the least able to afford air source heat pumps and building efficiency retrofits. These are things that have a high upfront cost. More of those customers are renters, et cetera. So they're most likely to be left behind on the gas system, paying higher rates for all of their heating needs, which means really high bills. And the wealthier customers who more predominantly own homes and could afford the upfront cost of electrification will also have higher rates, but most of the year they don't need the gas. They need only gas, maybe gas for backup. So despite high rates, they'll have the lower bills. So that's a regressive and inequitable outcome, and one that we really have to think about in how we pursue the transition. Finally, just thinking about some of the policy measures that could help. I think we do need to think about new regulatory pathways for fuel switching, beneficial electrification, ways to incorporate renewable natural gas and hydrogen onto the system, dedicated pathway for beneficial electrification, removing barriers to fuel switching in DSM programs, things like that. I won't, since I'm running out of time, I don't want to go more deeply into that, but those are things we can talk more about in the later part in the Q&A. And then I wanted to just wrap up by kind of tying back to on the last slide, tying back to the roadmap and some of the, what to me are key findings of the roadmap that, that really resonate with our strategy. One, more efficient buildings and appliances are an important enabler, regardless what mix of electrification and natural gas and lower carbon gaseous fuels we end up with. So that's an important kind of enabler of the strategy. Second, a significant amount of building energy demand could shift to electricity. It might be less in the cold part of the Midcontinent than it is in the south, but it's still going to be pretty significant. That will mean lower gas throughput. So, and potentially this winter peak challenge. So we really need to think about how we manage that transition. Third, we need to deeply decarbonize electricity to make sure that electrification of natural gas end uses really promotes the greatest carbon reductions. And the electrification roadmap points to some of the ways to do that, to get to a 95% decarbonized electricity system. And finally, given some of the challenges to heat pump adoption in the northern part of the region, we do think alternatives like RNG and hydrogen might prove important, but they're limited in supply, and there's a lot of competing uses for them. So they do have some advantages. You don't have to have millions of customers making individual decisions to change their gas appliance to an electric one. You can sort of bring down the carbon intensity of the system overall by introducing these fuels into existing infrastructure. But a lot of work, but these fuels are significantly more expensive than natural gas today, and a lot of work is going to have to be done to create regulatory mechanisms that allow utilities to incorporate them and to sort of build out a hydrogen economy. If you think about hydrogen being useful across multiple sectors, but we really need a lot of concerted effort to sort of build that hydrogen infrastructure and bring the cost down dramatically if hydrogen could ultimately play any significant role in natural gas decarbonization. So I'll stop there. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Nick. That was terrific. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to Audrey, but if folks have questions for Nick, go ahead and put them in the chat. And Nick, if you want to monitor that, may be able to respond to them. And if we have time at the end, we'll come back to them. But I want to make sure we save some time for Audrey here. Audrey Partridge is the Regulatory Policy Manager at Center for Energy and Environment. She joined CEE in 2017. Works with their policy team on developing and advocating for CE positions and matters before Minnesota's regulatory agencies and in other public forums, working closely with experts and with other stakeholders. Prior to CEE, Audrey worked on energy conservation policy and related regulatory topics at CenterPoint Energy. She earned her bachelor's degree from Macalester College and a master's from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and has been a great partner with GPI on a number of projects. And Audrey, glad to have you with us today, and please take it away.
Thanks, Doug. So as Doug said, I'm Audrey. I'm the Regulatory Policy Manager at Center for Energy and Environment. And we also participated in the MPSC roadmap to decarbonization in the Midcontinent Buildings Edition. So I'm here with you today, similar to Nick, to talk through some of the work we're doing as an organization around building decarbonization and how it connects and relates to the roadmap. First, I want to thank GPI for putting so much work into pulling together this broad group of stakeholders that were involved in the roadmap and shepherding us through the process. We've been involved, similar to Xcel Energy, with the MPSC process from the beginning. The building sector is especially near and dear to our hearts, and we are particularly proud of this report. So for anyone who hasn't read it, we encourage you to do so. Next slide, please. Now a little bit about Center for Energy and Environment and the experience and perspective we bring. CEE is a Minnesota-based clean energy nonprofit with deep organizational expertise in energy efficiency and other clean energy solutions, dating back more than 40 years. CEE employs over 160 people across a wide range of areas, including energy efficiency program development and delivery, energy and technology research, community engagement and energy planning, energy and building improvement financing, and clean energy policy advocacy. Our organizational mission, which underlies our work in all of these areas, is to discover and deploy the most effective energy solutions that both strengthen the economy and improve the environment. And as you can see from our organizational values, we believe in the power of collaboration, which I think is really one of the most important features of the MPSC roadmap process. And though it appears as background in this report, I think it's important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Now back to CEE for a little bit. From our roots to our core, we are an energy efficiency organization. And for the last 40 some years, buildings have been our thing. So we've been focused on building efficiency for decades, but increasingly we've been focused on the significant role that energy efficiency and importantly, emerging efficient technologies can play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in our building sector. Next slide, please. And here's why. Minnesota has greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals set in statute. Our state goals are based on our 2007 Next Generation Energy Act. And this law sets goals to reduce emissions over 2005 levels by 15% by 2015, 30% by 2025, and finally by 80% by 2050. We missed, as you can see, our 2015 milestone goal, and we are not on track to meet our 2025 goal. In fact, the only sector in Minnesota that's on track to meet the 2025 greenhouse gas reduction goal is the electric sector. Next slide, please. So you've already seen this one from Nick, but we both decided it was worth putting up twice. Drilling down to look at our state's emissions by sector, you see that Minnesota has a growing building emissions problem. As you can see here, the electric sector is making great progress, reducing emissions by 29% from 2005 to 2018. Transportation, agriculture, and waste are sort of holding steady or decreasing slightly, which I'll note is insufficient. But what I find really striking is that emissions in the building sector have been going up a lot since our state set emissions reduction goals. The residential sector has 32% higher emissions today than in 2005. The commercial sector emissions are 15% higher today. That trend, as Nick mentioned, is being driven primarily by emissions from natural gas end uses. Next slide. So knowing that, my colleague, Robbie Vandergaan, and I started digging into our state's natural gas consumption trends. And this graph shows Minnesota's natural gas consumption since 2005. Our gas consumption in the residential, commercial, and industrial sector, so that does not include electric generation, has gone up 32% since 2005. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but some factors include the fact that new homes are getting larger, older homes are remaining inefficient, so we're not losing that load. Large industrial customers may be switching to inexpensive natural gas from other fuels. And natural gas service is being extended to more and more communities in Minnesota. Next slide, please. So an extension of that research, we decided to dive into emissions. And as you would guess, as consumption goes, so do our emissions. This graph shows emissions resulting from Minnesota's consumption of natural gas in the residential, commercial, and industrial sector in context with Minnesota's 2050 annual greenhouse gas budget. And that budget was derived from that 80% greenhouse gas reduction I mentioned earlier. So as you can see, this graph accounts for combustion emissions in dark blue and leakage emissions in red, yellow, and light blue by source. In 2019, natural gas emissions accounted for 86% of Minnesota's all-in economy-wide greenhouse gas budget for 2050. That means that even if we froze our consumption of natural gas today, we would eat up the vast majority of our total annual greenhouse gas budget with just natural gas end-use emissions alone. If we continue on our current trajectory of growth, we'll actually surpass our state's total economy-wide 2050 annual greenhouse gas budget with emissions from natural gas end uses alone. And keep in mind that Minnesota's 2050 greenhouse gas budget is not consistent with the latest science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. To do that, of course, we need to be essentially carbon neutral or at zero emissions by 2040 to 2050. So all that I've said so far gives you a sense of why we were part of the MPSC process and why the roadmap is so important. In our state specifically, we're watching building sector emissions get away from us. And we, and I say we, the collective, have been really focused on emissions in the electric sector and transportation sector, and for good reason, given the scale of emissions coming from those sectors, as Nick mentioned. And we'll continue to need to make progress there, but we also need to get serious about emissions in buildings and acknowledge that what we are doing today is simply not enough. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to dive into the what CEE envisions for a decarbonized building sector. Last year, CEE put together a 2040 vision for equitable decarbonization of the building sector. CEE worked across all our internal departments to develop the vision document, and it describes an equitable future economy powered by decarbonized electricity and decarbonized gaseous fuels. Sorry about that, you guys. It will guide the work we do over the coming years and perhaps decades. All right, next slide, please. Our vision includes a more diverse, highly skilled future energy workforce with high quality and family sustaining jobs. Buildings will be extremely efficient, enabling utilities to use building energy systems coupled with grid modernization investments as assets to improve reliability and manage the system. The elimination of fossil gas in our buildings. The traditional gas utilities will be more specialized, delivering backup heat services, transportation fuels, efficiency services, and low carbon gaseous fuels. An evolved regulatory system will ensure the equitable allocation of system costs and benefits, avoidance of environmental and public health damage, exceptional customer service, and expanded customer opportunities, the development of a utility workforce representative of the communities they serve, and a commitment to support communities in achieving energy and environmental goals. And finally, the vision will be made possible through coordination, foresight, market innovation, and a commitment to the public good. Next slide, please. So now we know where we want to go and we know why we want to go there. So we're at the how to get there part. As you might expect, we've been thinking a lot about that. And in fact, I think it turns out we were working on the how of this before we really realized what we were shooting for exactly. We've been developing and advancing strategies for building decarbonization all along for our work in policy, programs, research, lending, and community engagement. The MPSC roadmap pulled many of these strategies together into a comprehensive framework, and importantly, supports and validates much of the work we are doing. The path to decarbonization of the building sector is not going to be an easy one. We need everybody to be rowing in the same direction in a coordinated and enthusiastic way. By laying out the path, the MPSC roadmap report sets us up for that coordinated approach we need. And now for some of the specific strategies we're working on. Next slide, please. First, building envelope efficiency. As I said, this is really our bread and butter. So we've been working on building envelope efficiency for decades. Here's some of our most recent work. Next slide, please. In recent years, we've been conducting research on an air sealing technology that can be applied through an aerosol. This is something that can be done in existing occupied homes. And we've tested the technology in the multifamily setting and now the single family setting. Through our research, we're developing a best practice guide for cost-effective aerosol envelope sealing that can increase building envelopes tightness by 75%. This work and much of our work is funded by the Minnesota Department of Commerce through a wonderful research and development program that they run called CARD, or Conservation Applied Research and Development Program. Next slide, please. Another exciting CARD project is focused on what we call deep energy retrofits, which is essentially weatherization on steroids. Minnesota homes use twice the energy of the national average, and older homes have about 30% higher space heating loads than new construction, even though they're about 50% smaller. Lower income residents are most likely to inhabit older building stock and thus face disproportionately high energy use and energy burden. Weatherization efforts have successfully delivered cost-effective envelope improvements for decades, but they don't go far enough, and weatherized buildings still lag new construction both in efficiency and comfort. The goal of this work is to study envelope measure packages that make up that savings gap that's left by traditional weatherization programs. To date, prevailing thinking is that these levels of energy savings are not cost-effective, but no one has really tested that. So this study will identify opportunities to deploy the next level of weatherization measures necessary to create high performance envelopes. The study will detail existing building stock and applicable measures to understand savings, costs, and cost effectiveness testing across existing Minnesota single family homes. This is the first step to identifying and thinking through the deployment of upgraded envelopes, which are not only the largest source of energy efficiency potential in the state, but are ultimately required upgrades to meet our climate goals. Next slide, please. And now we're to my second favorite strategy, which I think Jessi said was her first. And we're going to talk about air source heat pumps. Next slide, please. So starting back in 2015, CEE conducted field tests to study cold climate air source heat pumps in our Minnesota weather. The roadmap provided some great data showing just how important air source heat pump performance is in the coldest parts of the Midcontinent. It's important for system efficiency and building level efficiency, but it's also really important that equipment meets customers' expectations and it works as promised. CEE's work in this area found that the efficiency and capacity of older air source heat pumps drops significantly when temperatures hit about 40 degrees. But the newest generation of cold climate air source heat pumps can operate down to negative 13 degrees Fahrenheit. CEE's researchers not only confirmed the operation of these new generation air source heat pump technologies, but also developed installation requirements and recommendations. And again, this was a CARD project. Next slide. Building on that work, CEE research staff modeled cold climate heat pump performance across the typical Minnesota winter and summer to understand their impacts on energy use in the electricity grid. Research staff found that heat pumps reduce the winter peaks of traditional electric technologies, so electric resistance, approximately 10 times more than they reduce summer peaks. What that means is that for every electric resistance home converted to a heat pump, 2 fossil fuel homes can convert to a heat pump with no effect on electric peak demand. This is an exciting finding because while most Minnesotans heat with natural gas, we do have a significant amount of buildings heated with electricity. Converting electric resistance buildings as we convert homes heated by fossil fuels gives us room to electrify while managing system peaks and of course costs. Next slide, please. Here we've combined my 2 favorite strategies, so building envelope efficiency improvements with cold climate air source heat pumps to examine the costs of different heating and cooling options. Our research found that deep energy retrofits save customers money and reduce peak electricity demand, and a well-insulated home can become a flexible asset for load management. A well-insulated home also moderates the operational costs of switching from gas to an electric air source heat pump. At current prices, a natural gas furnace and typical central air conditioner still operate at about half the annual cost of a heat pump. However, insulating the home to a deep retrofit level decreases annual costs so that they are on par with the fossil fuel option. Next slide, please. So clearly our research in the MPSC roadmap shows great promise for air source heat pumps in Minnesota, but that doesn't mean that they'll suddenly take off. As mentioned in the roadmap, there are plenty of barriers to air source heat pump adoption. And so we formed something called the Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative. This effort is an attempt to lower what the roadmap called the hurdle rate for cold climate air source heat pumps. The Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative is a CEE initiative in partnership with 5 different Minnesota utilities working to accelerate the market adoption of air source heat pumps across Minnesota. The goal of the initiative is to ensure that by 2030, air source heat pumps are the first choice for contractors and homeowners replacing electric and delivered fuel heating systems or air conditioners, and that every installed system will be optimized to provide heating as well as cooling. Next slide. The collaborative is working to develop strong relationships with manufacturers, distributors, and contractors to more broadly and quickly spur market growth and bring down costs. Our strategies include supporting technology advancement by providing guidance on beneficial application types, product specs, and installation practices, equipping contractors and distributors with knowledge and comfort of cold climate air source heat pump technologies, supporting aspiring market leaders to integrate cold climate air source heat pump knowledge and market growth tactics into their businesses, and educating customers by working with utilities and on-the-ground partners to inform customers about air source heat pump options. Next slide, please. So these strategies that I've listed above must eventually be pursued at scale to decarbonize the building sector and quickly in order to meet our climate goals. So we turn to partners and policies. CEE, and this one is in collaboration with GPI, convenes and facilitates a stakeholder process in Minnesota focused on decarbonization of our natural gas end users in the state. As you guess, this process and the MPSC roadmap for buildings overlap a lot, both in terms of content, because the majority of our stakeholder discussions are about building emissions, and in terms of approach. We are taking a collaborative approach to the process and seeking consensus among stakeholders around recommendations. At the most basic level, the stakeholder process was convened to explore and learn about pathways and strategies for decarbonization, and then develop recommendations for decarbonizing natural gas end uses in Minnesota. Just a note, the stakeholder process includes both building and industry emissions, but does not include emissions from natural gas used for electric generation. We are taking a portfolio approach, considering the various end uses for natural gas in our state, and then looking at the different technologies and fuels that may best decarbonize them. To facilitate recommendations, we used a scenario planning model, and we worked with E3, that national consulting firm Nick mentioned, to model out 3 distinct decarbonization scenarios for that exercise. And finally, the ultimate goal of the process is to have a set of recommendations that all participants can agree upon and take action to move forward. Next slide. We convened the group in November of 2019 and have been meeting about monthly since. We have a planning meeting that includes Xcel Energy, and in fact, Nick is our representative from Xcel, CenterPoint Energy, and the City of Minneapolis, and Fresh Energy. The stakeholders of the group include representatives from labor, clean energy organizations, state agencies, utilities, and cities. And we plan to publish our final report and recommendations by May of this year. Next slide, please. And last, but certainly not least, here's a list of some of the policy initiatives that we're working on in order to ensure that we have policies that enable and facilitate decarbonization of the building sector. And I think you'll see that the list of recommendations in the MPSC roadmap really align nicely with this list of policy initiatives. So for legislation, we've helped to develop and are advocating for the Minnesota Efficient Technology Accelerator. And under META, CEE would work with the Department of Commerce and participating utilities to accelerate the deployment of efficient technologies by working with upstream entities. This is similar to the work MEA does around market transformation out in the Northwest. The Energy Conservation and Optimization Act would expand our state's energy efficiency program, which we call SIP, to include load management and efficient fuel switching. The Natural Gas Innovation Act is a piece of legislation that provides a path for natural gas utilities to invest in innovative low and no carbon resources. On the regulatory side, we're working through a Minnesota Department of Commerce stakeholder process to review and potentially update SIP cost effectiveness practices. We advocate for improvements to SIP, load management, rate design, and RNG programs and filings. We participate in a docket to develop performance metrics for Xcel Energy to better align regulation with the public interest, including emissions reductions. We also work on policy initiatives at the local level, like time of sale energy disclosure policies and building benchmarking policies. All right, last slide. So that was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks. Really appreciate it, Audrey, and thank you to Nick, and thank you to Jessi. Unfortunately, we're out of time for the day, so obviously a lot of great information there, and so we may think about doing something in the future to try to explore some of these issues more deeply. But a lot to think about. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody on the call. Thanks very much to our speakers. Thanks to Franz and Kate for their work on the project, and really appreciate you being with us. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everybody.